Grace and Grit has been the name of my business for the last 13 years, the name of this podcast for the last, 11 years that we've been running this show. And it really is the heart of everything that I teach. So today, because I haven't done it in a minute, I want to go deeper into that name because there's a lot of new listeners, people who maybe have never heard me explain where this name comes from or the meaning that it holds. And a lot of people hear those words and nod along with it without really sitting with what they mean. And more importantly, what finding the balance between them actually requires. And spoiler, it's a little different for every person. And finding your own sweet spot is some of the most important work that you will ever do. Welcome to your daily hit of Grace and Grit, your quick dose of inspiration to kickstart your day. I'm Courtney Townley, and here is today's hit. So grace, in the context that I teach it, of course, is never weakness. It's not lowering the bar or letting yourself off the hook indefinitely. It's the compassion, the empathy, the honest acceptance of where you actually are right now as the necessary foundation for real change. So I always think of that quote, I think it's Sophia Bush, that you can be a masterpiece and a work in progress at the same time. And grace speaks to the masterpiece. It's the acceptance. It's acknowledging that you are whole and worthy and worth your own time and effort. The work in progress part is where grit comes in. And we'll talk about the grit in a second. But sticking with grace for a minute here, you cannot shame yourself into health. You can't criticize yourself into a better life. And the research on this is really clear. And anyone who has tried the self-punishment route for any length of time knows in their bones it doesn't work. Not for very long. Grace is what creates the psychological safety to just be honest about where you are, to admit what isn't working, to try something new without the crushing fear of failure. Grace is the soil that sustainable change grows in. But here's where grace gets complicated. Grace can be weaponized. It can become a sophisticated rationalization for not having to do anything hard. I'm being gentle with myself can quietly become, I've stopped expecting anything of myself. And that has a very steep cost. So grit is the willingness to lean into discomfort. It's leaning into the work that your life is calling you into, to do the hard thing when the easy thing is available, to show up for your commitments even when motivation has left the building, to do the work consistently, imperfectly, persistently, especially when you don't feel like it. Right? Grit is what builds the life you actually want rather than the one that just happens to you. But grit without grace is its own kind of trap. I know this personally because I have always been one to lean heavily towards the grit end of the spectrum. And for a long time, I was burning myself out, calling it discipline. I've also had seasons of leaning too far into grace, periods where I stayed too long on the comfortable side of effort, which was really not really applying much effort, where the price of that comfort quietly accumulated. So what I want you to hear is that there's obviously a cost to both extremes. I've always said living on one end of a spectrum is rarely healthy. And that's true of grace and grit. Like living all in grit or all in grace does not create a state of deep health. So here is what makes this genuinely complex and why I have built an entire brand around these concepts. Your sweet spot between grace and grit is not my sweet spot. It is not your best friend's sweet spot. It is not determined by what looks good on social media or what the latest wellness trend prescribes. Your sweet spot is determined by your radical honesty, by your history, your biology, your current season of life, your tendencies, your blind spots, your deepest values. And it shifts. What the right balance looks like when you're 35 and healthy and full of energy is different from what it looks like when you're 48, navigating perimenopause and elder care and 1,000 other things. And this is why self-knowledge is so incredibly important. It's not a luxury, it is the whole game. You are the only person who knows why you do what you do. You're the only person who can tell the difference between genuine self-compassion and sophisticated avoidance, between productive effort and self-destructive overreach. No one has access to that information but you. Because from the outside, we can't see any of it, right? Someone outside of you looking in on your life, all they see is what you're doing. They cannot see the why underneath it. So here are a few honest questions worth sitting with. I ask a lot of great questions in my book, The Consistency Code, but in case you haven't read it or you need the reminder, when things feel hard, what is your default move? Do you push through at all costs, or do you find a reason to back off? Neither answer is wrong, by the way, but knowing your tendency tells you which direction you probably tend to lean in. Because I have found that people tend to lean more towards grit or more towards grace. And just kind of knowing what your natural tendency is a really powerful thing to know. Are you doing hard things because they align with what you genuinely value, or because you're trying to prove something to someone? That distinction, I've learned the hard way, really matters. Because I have gone through seasons where I've pushed really, really hard, and it wasn't for my own benefit. It wasn't because of something I necessarily valued. It was because I was trying to earn love, respect, attention, accolades, you name it. When you give yourself grace, does it genuinely feel like self-compassion? Or does it feel like relief for not having to try? And how do you know? Because if you're giving yourself relief for not even having to try, you're going to feel regret in the aftermath. You're going to feel guilt. And again, only you know the answer. I don't know why you're giving yourself permission not to do the thing. Maybe it's a great reason. But also, maybe it's a hiding habit. The sweet spot is not a fixed destination. That's another thing to remember. It's a practice of constant, honest recalibration. Grace, when grace is what serves you. Grit, when grit is what serves you. And you could change that word serve to nourish. What nourishes you? Sometimes it is grace, sometimes it is grit. And the self-awareness to know which one that is at any given moment, well, that's everything. This is the work. Not the workouts, not the meal plans, not the productivity systems. The real work is knowing yourself well enough to know what you actually need and having the honesty and the courage to give it to yourself. That is what grace and grit looks like in practice. Not one or the other, but both in the right portions for you at the right time. So do the work of finding your sweet spot and keep finding it, because it will keep moving. And so will you. If this stirred something inside of you, imagine what a whole book of clarity and courage could ignite. The Consistency Code, a midlife woman's guide to deep health and happiness, goes even deeper into the mindset and practices that create real, meaningful change at midlife. Grab your copy today over at theconsistencycode.com and keep the momentum alive.